Abigail Disney, thank you for agreeing to see us and talk about your work.
Thank you.
I'd like to talk about three various themes with you. First, a little bit about women's experiences in war, about women's mobilization for political participation, and the role of research and knowledge. So I thought we could start by women's experiences. And I'd want to ask you, you've said before about this TV series that you have produced, Women, War and Peace, which is a 5-film series, that the view of war has been misconstrued because it's been viewed by men. And you have explained before, which I think is great, that if you put a camera on a woman's forehead and you follow her through a conflict area, it'll look very different.
Yeah,
and the films that you have made have really depicted very different experiences that women have. But across these films that you have made, are there certain common themes that lure in the background that you could tell us about?
Yeah, well, we had the opportunity to make 5 films. If I could have made 25 films, I would have done that. Because there are certain themes that just pop up for every woman in every conflict situation. And those are the themes, like, there are the big ones, like sexual violence. And that ranges all the way from sexual harassment to sexual assault to up to trafficking and forced prostitution and things like that. And those are just simply, those things are just there in every conflict. And we're talking about conflicts that go all the way back to prehistory. And then dislocation is a very important theme. The being displaced from your family, from your home, from your life, from your traditions, from your culture, from your the landscape you're used to, and the how you expected to be able to bring this family up. We, I think, underestimate the amount of the burden that women carry in those situations. I always say to people that we should just rub out the words women and children and just not use them in that way anymore, because it tends to make women sound like children, that they're in the same category together. But of course, they're in the category of non-aggressors. But it should be more like women and all the people who rely on women to keep going every day. So it's women plus children and elders and sick and disabled and so forth. And when you remember it that way, you start thinking, oh my gosh, that's right. She's doing all these things that are incredibly difficult and traumatizing, while also having to care for everybody else who's as traumatized as she is. So that's a really important thing, and it's really valuable to look through her eyes, in part because I think that there's a sort of a government in exile that forms in almost every community of women during wartime, but especially when they're displaced. They figure out where the water is and how to take care of the children and where are the safe places and where there aren't. Whether or not there's an international agency, they're helping them figure that out. And it seems to me that it's time we start respecting the government in exile a little more when we arrive and offer help. And if we understood the way women self-organize to advocate for the whole community, we might be willing to respect the indigenous knowledge that they bring to the problems. So displacement is really, really important. There are other sub-themes that are really interesting, and they kind of come up everywhere, like the issue of just bearing witness. I mean, I think that the enforced passivity of the non-aggressor in a setting where the only value is aggression and power and physical force tends to make a person, I think, wonder, like, where can I be an agent? Or even when can I be an agent in my own destiny? And I think a lot of women feel compelled to step up and speak, even if they can't speak in the moment and in the context, to reserve their stories and hold on to them, knowing that at some point in the future, there will be an opportunity to speak the truth, to find some kind of justice, or even just to tell what's happened. And the women that I meet in post-conflict settings, it's so important to them just to be heard for their stories, because I think it's a way of feeling respected all over again. We underestimate just how enormous the emotional content is. We tend to dismiss that as something that's soft. But of course, it's so shaping of the post-conflict period. And it's not just the women who are affected emotionally, but because they are the centers of family life and community life, they tend to carry the weight of the emotional impact of the war, the trauma, the psychological damage, the injuries not only to people's human dignity, but also to the traditions, to the culture, to the traditional learning. And so we really need to also, when we look at war, look at the post-conflict period. And I don't think that as international actors we've really respected enough the fact that there are enormous emotional, not deficits exactly, but areas of great trauma that are in and of themselves incredibly disabling. They affect, the economic recovery of a place. They affect your ability to build a functioning, viable, sustainable political system. A democracy is made of individuals the way a wall is made of bricks. And every single brick is so traumatized it's difficult to function. So the primary reason to make 5 different films really broadly distributed geographically was to make sure that we have a look at those resonances that cross all the cultures. And so there's this extraordinarily powerful thing that happens when you hear an Afghan woman talk about, I think there was some language that someone used about traveling without a destination, which is what it's like to be displaced from your home. To hear language almost exactly like that in Spanish from a woman in Colombia is an extraordinary thing, because what you realize is that when you strip out the politics and the particular weapons and the ethnic tensions and the landscape and all the things that we report on when we talk about war, when you strip those details out, it's the same thing for everyone everywhere. And the woman's experience of it then tends to call out the universal aspects of it.
One theme that is recurrent in the movies, not all of them are about this, but at least the one from Afghanistan and Liberia are about women's mobilization. And there is a moment also in the Afghanistan movie where a group of women are gathered. They're going to this jirga and discuss how to strategize because there aren't that many women present. And at one moment the woman says, we need to educate the others, not ourselves. What are the main challenges you think for women's political mobilization from what you've seen and the research that you did in connection with the films?
Yeah, we found women mobilizing in every single conflict, even if that's the single least reported aspect of the way war happens. There's a group of women organizing, I guarantee you, in Syria right now, because it just always happens. And the first obstacle they face is being taken seriously, because it's an environment where no one values anything except force. Then people who aren't using force to be heard will simply never be taken seriously. And so they're not taken seriously right up until the moment that they demonstrate some kind of irrefutable power, which is what the women in Liberia did. If security won't arrest you, then you've crossed some kind of Rubicon and you can be taken seriously. But that's a huge piece of it. So for the Afghan women, it's not just that they're not being taken seriously by their government or by the Taliban. The international actors very often will talk a very good game, but show up with an all-male delegation. Or in some cases, they overestimate the resistance of the Afghan men to working with Afghan women. I thought it was really interesting. We had this one moment at the Jirga where it's the first meeting that a lot of these men have had in a room where there are women present that they're not related to. And there's a man running the meeting, and he just stands up and he says, they're just like your sisters and your mothers, and they're Afghan too, so here we are, deal with it. And everybody deals with it, and they get on with it, and they have a meeting. But half an hour later in the same film, we get pushed back on by a government representative who says, oh, these men, they can't possibly meet with women. So I think that sometimes we overstate the resistance. to some extent in the international community, because maybe at some level we buy it a little bit.
Mm-hmm. When women do succeed to mobilize then for political change, for peaceful or for work for peace, do you think that they have different ways that they can mobilize that differ from those of men?
Yeah.
That there is an untapped potential there for a different kind of political mobilization?
Yeah. Well, I really believe women do organize differently, and I'm not necessarily that persuaded that the differences are necessarily biological. And that's kind of the first pushback you get when you say that is, oh, come on, everybody knows Margaret Thatcher started wars. And I don't think women are necessarily more peaceful, but I do think that they live lives in almost every community where they're at a disadvantage. They're left out of the political and cultural institutions and religious institutions that benefit by the current political state. And they can't appeal to violence in many cases because they simply, don't have the weapons or don't have the physical ability to win in a physical fight. So they develop other means by which to organize themselves. And so they do things differently because they have to develop a different set of tools for political mobilizing. So the women in Liberia, in fact, mobilized very much along the lines of a traditional nonviolent organizing. So they pushed and they pushed and they pushed. They held their moral ground in spite of all of the appeals to them to change their arguments. They stayed above the particulars of politics. And when they made their biggest and most desperate appeal, it was an appeal to, yes, emotion, which is a dirty word in a peace negotiation, to compassion, to morality, to faith, and they did it as very specifically and it's stated very clearly as mothers. And there was one warlord in the room who told us, at the beginning of the conversation, they said, oh, those women, they were nothing. They were just our conscience. But 10 minutes later, when I asked him about it again, he said, well, it's funny. There wasn't one man in the room at that moment who didn't ask himself, what did I do to get us to this moment? And that's a pretty powerful, I can't think of a political strategy that achieves that kind of a result in any context. I keep thinking if my Congress ever had a moment where everybody there would think about what they did to get us to that moment, we'd have a very different discourse. So it was classic nonviolent resistance, except for the fact that this appeal to the mother's voice is not a small thing. It's not an emotional thing. It's not some sort of gushy, new age thing. I think that a mother's voice is in almost every person's life the first voice. It's the first voice that says it loves you. It's the first voice that says share your toys. It's the voice that civilizes you, that brings you into culture, that teaches you right from wrong. And I do think that in a moment where you can get everyone to sort of stop and hear it again, it has a special power.
That's a good way of describing it, I think. Turning to the role of knowledge and research. I'm a peace researcher at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. And we try to generate knowledge that is helpful for the world.
Yes.
But we are not filmmakers. So as a peace scholar and a person who writes for an academic audience, I really envy you that you work with such a powerful medium and that you reach so many people with your important work. What kind of advice would you give to researchers who write whose primary audience is a bit different, to reach out to other audiences who can use our knowledge in different ways?
Exactly. Well, one of the things when we started making these films was so striking was the lack of research. It was very difficult to find.
What was mostly lacking that you
there
were surprised
there
about?
Was no disaggregated data. There was no data that separated the women out from the men, that told us what women were doing. You would have casualty figures and they'd be for civilians, but you really couldn't say, what kind of civilians. It's very gushy statistics around who dies as a result of disease or starvation, and was that conflict connected? You know, there were all these just incredibly gray areas, and so it was impossible to make a firm statement, you know, from a journalistic point of view, that you could really source. Right. It was really frustrating. But of course, what we had was anecdotes, you know, so we did our research, and we got as much information as we could, but then that really, because we're not researchers, we're communicators, and those are very different things. So what we did was then find the stories that really shed light on the general principles that we had started to pull out of our research. I think that researchers are seldom communicators. It's, you know, it's a very different skill set, and often a very different personality type. And so I think that what researchers need to do is to be always aware of their shortcomings in terms of how they speak for the general population, if that's who they want to communicate with, and work with people who professionally communicate, because there really is so much to material that we haven't used and gotten out into public knowledge. I mean, at least in my country, peace is still kind of not a word that's very respected. And it would be nice to see it gain some stature in this country, and across the developed world. So the research is really important and valuable, in part because I think people are increasingly coming to understand that peace is not just an absence of shooting, and just the way divorce, you know, and marriage are not. Marriage is not the absence of a divorce. It's the presence of all sorts of positive, constructive, loving interactions. And I think we need to do a better job of exploring that, kind of, and opening a public discourse about it. Researchers communicate well with other researchers through conferences and publications and so forth. And it would be great to see if there were a way to kind of bring people together so that then all of this incredible knowledge could maybe break out of the little container and make its way out into the mainstream public discourse.
But in one of your films, you do refer quite a lot to the first film, which is kind of an overview film about women's situations in war and about the new wars. What kind of knowledge did you find or research was most helpful? Now you've talked a little bit about what's lacking, but something must have been helpful, and what was that?
Yes, there was a lot of new thinking happening, and I think that really the last 20 years have shown us wars, both the wars in the 90s, particularly in Bosnia and Rwanda, and then, of course, the American engagements in Afghanistan and Iraq have, I think, opened people's eyes up to the idea that we're not really going to be looking at, you know, General Patton and the Battle of the Bulge ever again. And that is just not going to happen. And anytime you have a big global superpower like the United States engaged in a conflict, they're going to be in an asymmetrical conflict, which by definition means they're going to be engaged with counterinsurgencies, they're going to be moving through villages and having to deal with civilian populations. It's just a different pursuit. And there's no gun big enough to solve that problem. And so there is a really rich school of thought now, both inside of the US military. I've been very surprised to find how much really vigorous discourse there is going on in the US military about the future of the American military and where we're headed and what we need, therefore, as well as outside in the research community about what war will look like going forward, and therefore how women will fit into it. Because there's just no way that we can move in the direction of these asymmetrical conflicts going forward and not know that women are going to be right in the center of them. And I've heard this not only from people outside of the military, but inside of the armed forces. I've heard it from more than one place, that the more we see this kind of conflict, the more we're going to have to be about conflict resolution. And the more we want to be about conflict resolution, the more we'll need to be about women.